Thom Hartmann here with you. On the line with us is May Davis, visiting legal scholar with the Independent Women's Forum, IWF.org. May Mailman is May's Twitter handle, M-A-Y Mailman, or IWF for the Independent Women's Forum, IWF.org. May, welcome to the program. You wrote an op-ed here for the Independent Women's Forum titled "The Soft Bigotry of Liberal Election Lawyers Will Backfire." You want to give us the Cliff Notes version?
I do, and thanks for having me on your show. I think it's really important and amazing intellectual capacity of your listeners to hear all sorts of viewpoints, and I'm grateful for the service you are doing to our nation. But the Cliff Notes version is we see a lot of litigation being filed in Texas and in Georgia, and my thesis basically is, well, is it that these laws are particularly racist, or is there something else going on? And I think there's something else going on. I think this is about ginning up momentum, I guess you could call it, but also inflaming the racial divide. These states don't have particularly unique laws. They're similar to a lot of other states where we don't see litigation.
You're talking about the Republican-controlled states that are passing what the Democrats are referring to as voter suppression laws.
Exactly. Okay. And so you've got other states that have roughly similar, maybe a few days extra voting here, a few days less here, but not completely different. Voter ID laws are pretty standard, for example. So, you know, questioning why are we picking these states? But then the other thing is I do take issue with the suggestion that minorities are unable to comply with reasonable voting restrictions. In Mississippi, black voters showed up in higher rates than white voters, and Mississippi has some of the strictest laws in the country. And then also when you tell people that the system is rigged against you and the system is not working for you and the system is racist, people begin to internalize it. And I saw that especially happen to Republicans in Georgia, where Republicans didn't show up to vote because the system is rigged against you. This type of voting system doesn't work for you.
Because they believe Donald Trump.
Exactly. So you had Donald Trump and a lot of other people, I think, also at that time saying, we don't know about this type of voting. We don't know. And so what happens to people? They stayed home, and that hurt Republicans. And what happens when that happens to Democrats? You tell minorities, the system is rigged against you. It's harder for you to vote. And then does that bring up a feeling of empowerment in the system? And I think it really doesn't.
I suspect that there's something very different between having the President of the United States or a guy running for President of the United States tell his voters that the voting machines are rigged, that the system is rigged, that their vote won't be counted, that it's all, you know, because Trump was anticipating that he was going to lose to Hillary Clinton. He was using this rhetoric even long before he won the 2016 election. And I think, and there is some evidence that in that and subsequent elections, Republicans didn't show up in some cases because they thought, hey, it's rigged, screw it. But I think that's a qualitatively different thing from being told that in Harris County, in Dallas, you know, with 5 million people or more, instead of having 14 districts where you can have drop-off boxes for your ballots, we're gonna make you have only one, or being told that your local precinct where you've been voting for years and years, that's been run every single year by a local person that you know who lives in your neighborhood, and frankly, in the case, since you know you're talking about race here, in a black neighborhood, it's being run by a black person who's a friend and a member of the community. Now that person has been replaced by a white Republican who doesn't live in the community because Texas and Georgia have changed their laws so that basically the Republican power structure can take over the local voting system. And then that person decides when you show up to vote whether you get an actual ballot or a provisional ballot, knowing that, you know, in a large percentage of the cases, provisional ballots don't get counted. And in the first pass count, provisional ballots never get counted. You know, that kind of explicit voter suppression, which is now law in some 20 states you know, that are all controlled by Republicans, that I don't think that that's going to discourage voters, the way Trump lying about the whole thing is rigged. I think, I do think, though, that it's going to reduce the count because, if you can increase and also you got the 2018 decision by the Supreme Court that said that, if Ohio wants to purge people from the voting rolls in largely black communities, that's fine. It's entirely up to the state. And so now you've got states that are going into counties that are heavily Democratic, particularly heavily black, but also heavily Democratic, places where there's a lot of students or a lot of retired people, Social Security voters, and simply purging people off the voting rolls, willy-nilly, with no supervision and in fact, their ability to do that has been enhanced by these laws. So when those people show up at the polls, they're not on the list, so they get a provisional ballot. And again, the provisional ballots, the only way to get your provisional ballot counted if you've been purged is to show up 2 or 3 days later at the Secretary of State's office or the local county recorder's office and say, here I am, here's my ID, I shouldn't have been purged. And nobody does that. So I think that it could have some impact, but I think you're trying to compare apples to oranges, May.
Well, I do think you're right. There are differences between people who maybe haven't experienced something like you said, where a provisional ballot doesn't get counted, versus maybe in Georgia there was no reason for somebody to not vote because the story didn't happen to their friend. It was sort of spoken of at a higher level. But I think the larger point is, how should we encourage voters to vote? Because I do think that if you are an American and you want to vote, you can vote. It doesn't matter what the color of your skin is. It doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. If you want to vote, you can vote. And
tell that to Martin Luther King's cousin, who at 92, who had voted in the same precinct for 60 years, showed up to vote in the last election and discovered that Brian Kemp had purged her from the voting rolls. At first, they refused to even let her in. A reporter showed up, and then they gave her a provisional ballot, and it was never counted.
But that has to do with, like you said, purging the voter rolls, which maybe there's a...
Which is now legal in 20 states, and the Supreme Court has said is legitimate as a political strategy.
And not as a political strategy.
Oh yeah, they said you can't do it as a racial strategy, but if you're doing it as a political strategy, read the case in the Ohio case in 2018.
It's a basic necessity that people not be enrolled to vote in multiple places. Can we forgive my interrupting, but at a time, can we take this to a 30,000-foot view for a second? Yes.
We used to use biometrics in the United States. When I was 7 years old, my mom was the person who checked people in to vote down at the elementary school where I went. And she would compare your signature to the signature on file. You had to show ID when you first registered to vote. This was back, I'm talking about like, when I was 7 years old, it was 1968, or 1958, excuse me. And you had to show ID when you registered to vote, but then every year when you voted, you signed the card, and my mom would compare that card to the original registration if the signature looked the same. That's a biometric identifier. Signatures are harder to fake than fake IDs are to buy. I can buy a fake ID in a dozen different names tomorrow. I can't change my signature. That worked in the United States for 100 years. It worked very, very effectively. We also have states that have mail-in voting. We've got 5 states now that are all mail-in voting. I'm in one of them, Oregon. We've been doing mail-in voting for more than 20 years, and we've never had any instances of fraud or apparent fraud. I mean, there have been a couple, maybe 3 or 4 questionable things, but I mean, literally nothing that would affect any election at all. Why does the Republican Party say biometrics, which is actually safer and harder to fake than an ID, we're going to discard that and we're going to go with an ID that can be expensive to get, and for people like my friend Jerry, who's lived in New York City for his entire life and has never had a driver's license because he's never owned a car, he lives in New York City, that he's going to have to, jump through hoops and oppose mail-in voting. I don't get it.
Well, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution. For some states, they do still allow for signature matching. And each state, and now we're moving into real IDs, so the ease of which you could buy a fake ID in the past is certainly, for most states now, the situation, and is.
But in Texas, you don't need a real ID. You can use your gun registration.
But
not your college registration. Tell me this isn't weird.
Well, there's also just a lot more people.
Why any
every
ID at
single
all
year.
when you come to vote? Why not simply verify your signature? It's
Well,
the
maybe we
hardest
should
thing
do
to
that
fake there is.
When you get on a plane or when you go to the liquor store or when you do anything else, you always have to show your ID. It's become standard in our society.
Because that's how you determine your age or you know that you are, you know, that your name is spelled the way it's spelled on the ticket and all that kind of thing. That's apples and oranges. I don't get why, you know. And then you got like North Dakota, the most Republican state in the union. You've got saying, you know, they don't even have voter registration. You just show up and vote.
Well, like I said, there's only a few reasons why there's these lawsuits in certain states. And yeah, in some, North Dakota, it might not be there because they already have the most lax voting laws in the nation. But in others, Wyoming, which does have more strict voter restrictions, we don't see it because this is not actually about what is or isn't racist about a certain voting law. This is about, I want to create racial tension, my side versus your side, tribalism. Some people are trying to prevent you from voting when really IDs are part of our natural existence. I mean, it's like breathing to bring your ID with you when you leave your house. And so to use that as also, I'm going to use your identification for voting, just seems normal.
Okay, and you know, I'll give you that. It's almost certainly not going to go away. It's become part of America. You mentioned in your article that we're not talking here about terrorist groups blockading the polls. Yet the governor of Texas, or maybe it's the lieutenant governor, said that he wants to have 10,000 poll watchers, and you've got the Proud Boys volunteering. What's going on with that?
So poll watching, I think, it's becoming more and more of a problem because you only have some people taking videos here, which makes it look like there's something wrong going on, and just have more people to have more vantage points in today's age of social media is probably a good idea.
Okay. May, I'm sorry, we're hitting a hard break here at 18 minutes after. I can't push it any farther than that.